Clean Air Act can indeed provide basis for this agency to move forward with a whole slate of regulations on greenhouse gas emissions, something that was not contemplated in the drafting of the statute and does not produce an appropriate resolution for this country. The EPA is expected to soon finalize a rule to regulate the greenhouse gas emissions from light-duty vehicles. What concerns me in particular is not the light-duty vehicles, the mobile source regulations that would extend from the agency, but the subsequent triggering of regulatory reach to stationary sources that emit greenhouse gases, such as power plants and factories, for regulation. And in anticipation of this outcome, the EPA has announced a proposed rule requiring large industrial facilities and power plants to obtain construction and operating permits covering their emissions. These permits would require facilities to demonstrate the use of best available control technology and energy efficiency measures to minimize greenhouse gas emissions. The President's fiscal year 2011 budget proposes to provide more than $50 million to develop and implement these regulations. I believe that these regulations are ill-conceived, fundamentally because they're based on a statute that was initially enacted to address an entirely different range of issues. I believe that Congress should take the authorizing step of putting in place a statute relative to greenhouse gas emissions before agency activity moves forward. Again, the Supreme Court has held that greenhouse gas emissions can move forward under the Clean Air Act, but Congress ultimately is the ultimate decider of the basis by which this agency acts. And by dealing with this in the budget and appropriation process, we can prohibit the agency from acting under the wrong statute until the right statute is put into place. Our nation's energy sector is the heart of everything we do. It provides the gas that fuels our cars, electricity that turns our lights, and the fuel that heats our homes. In North Dakota and many parts of the country, the energy sector is a primary engine that has kept our economy strong while the rest of the country has struggled. The current Clean Air Act was not developed for greenhouse gas emissions, and it does not work to try and shoehorn greenhouse gas emissions into this statute. The obvious potential of lawsuit that will result from EPA's proposed rule relates to changing the regulatory threshold for stationary sources. I think we would all agree the thresholds in current law are completely unworkable for greenhouse gases. There are significant questions as to whether EPA has the authority to change this threshold for purposes of attaching their regulatory reach. If it's found that they don't have the authority, well, we could be looking at potentially millions of stationary sources now requiring review. There are also significant concerns over the availability of technology to meet regulations. Under the proposed rule, the EPA can force an emitter to install a best available control technology. It's known by the acronym BACT. In the early years of this program and for the foreseeable future, it's unclear what EPA would consider BACT compliant, as there are, as of yet, no commercially available technology for many existing sources and technologies for new plants that are either unproven or incredibly expensive. I'm worrying about the jobs this summer in the coal generating facilities found in the plains of North Dakota. Normally, you would have the utilities making it, or the co-ops making decisions to do their annual plant upgrades. This has the positive effect of lowering emissions and keeping the plant at best operating standard. What will be placed in question this summer is whether or not that kind of investment will be even made, because it won't know whether or not it'll pass muster with rules yet to be promulgated by the EPA on best available control technology. I think we could lose jobs. We could lose jobs as early as this summer and freeze everything in place in terms of plant maintenance, a very unfortunate result. Now, should Congress ever institute a greenhouse gas regulation law, and I believe it will, is likely to include substantial flexibility that will recognize economic concerns or trade-sensitive concerns and other issues that come to the fore in the legislative process and are appropriately considered as part of an enactment. Now, the EPA does not have this reach and this look as they move their regulation forward. That, again, is why we need to put the statute in place first before the regulation. For these reasons, I believe it's critical that Congress prevent the regulations. Let's stop the cart from being put in front of the horse. Let's prevent the regulations from being implemented. I have introduced legislation, Save Our Energy Jobs Act, H.R. 4396, that would remove the current authority to implement the regulations under that Supreme Court ruling until Congress puts the statute in place. Now, just in my final moment, Mr. Chairman, to the committee today, I'd like to discuss proposals to eliminate tax incentives for fossil fuels. Domestic oil and gas development is critical to America's economic and strategic future, and the majority of this development is currently being undertaken by independent producers, the very producers who will be hit hardest by the elimination of these tax incentives. These independent producers have come into North Dakota, developed technologies that can recover, it is now estimated, 4 billion barrels of oil, completely changing the economic outlook for North Dakota, but making a substantial change also in what we think can be contributed to domestic energy needs. A primary example, 115,000 barrels per day, moving to now more than 240,000 barrels per day just in the last 2 years alone. As is the case with most new domestic sources of oil and gas, this development's not cheap. The new wells, which go 2 miles down and then horizontally 2 miles, cost several millions of dollars from lease to completion. And the majority, again, of the companies picking these up are independent producers. They depend upon the existing tax structure, which has basically allowed the financing of this extraordinary capital requirement to develop these oil fields. Now, unless we're going to risk busting up the search for new domestic sources of fossil fuel, I believe that we need to keep these into place, and I would urge that as you put your budget together, you reject those budget proposals submitted by the administration.